I grew up involved in scouting and left around the age of 15. I've recently become involved again as a leader, and I had forgotten about my experiences camping in rural Australia until revisiting a campsite and reminiscing on some scary stories. I figured I would share it here and potentially get some insight on what this may have been. I was about 13 or 14 at the time and had gone on a camping trip with my troop. We went to a campsite we stayed at often, as it was only around 30 minutes away from our city. It was large and open to account for many scouts, as it acted as a hub for my state's combined activities that all groups would attend, but this particular camp was only for our group, which consisted of 10 to 12 people. We set up camp in a back corner of the campsite, which was backed by a fence and thick trees, leading to a cliff overlooking a river if you walked far enough. We arrived around 6 p.m, set up camp, and basically went straight to bed. It's fairly consistent in my area that asking 11 to 15-year-olds to set up camp takes far longer than it should, and we were pretty tired. In the centre of the campsite was a large toilet block surrounded by rocks and separated into 4 sections: male and female, adult and youth. Our campsite was probably about 300 or so metres from this block. The first 2 nights went without incident, but it was our 3rd night that something occurred that left myself and 2 others with a sleepless night and an apprehension to camping there again. It was 3 to a tent, and we all hopped into our sleeping bags for our last night before heading home. The others in the tent, we'll call them Olivia and Jess, dozed off fairly quickly, but it took me a little longer. I've always struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep, so when I seemingly randomly woke not long after dozing off, it wasn't a huge shock. Nothing seemed amiss at first, so I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep once again. It only took a few seconds for me to hear footsteps walking towards the toilet block. We were camped on an area of lush green grass that scrunched under your feet, and the sound of someone walking was distinct in the quiet night. I thought it was strange I hadn't heard a tent zipper, but brushed it off. A few minutes later I heard them approaching, still a normal course of events, until the footsteps stopped outside our tent. I looked over and both Olivia and Jess were sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't one of them. I waited a few seconds and they continued moving, so again I figured it was strange but brushed it off. It then sounded as though the footsteps looped around the group of tents and back to ours, the other side this time. The tents were set up in a line with a fair amount of distance between to account for guy ropes as wind had been forecast. But on this night the wind was almost non-existent. The person, or thing, had seemed to walk around the whole line to stop back at ours again, which was the second closest to the toilet block in the line of 4. I then heard them walk towards the tree line. I sat up, trying to listen as closely as I could now. At this point, I was sure it wasn't one of us. The behaviour of the footsteps was too strange, and why on earth had they sounded like they were walking into the trees? I think it was close to 2 a.m. at this point, and I had had enough of being alone experiencing this, and gently shook Olivia awake, shushing her as she stirred. Olivia was my closest friend in the group, and I whispered a quick explanation of what I had heard to her. We agreed to wait a while and see if anything else happened. Quite a few minutes passed, I don't remember how many, and the weirdness of the situation had started to wear off, and I was about to suggest trying to fall back asleep when the footsteps seemed to return from where they had left and again stop behind our tent. Olivia and I shared a look in the dim light the moon was casting in the tent, and I could tell she was as unsettled as I was. We heard them begin to slowly circle the tent, and she silently moved to huddle next to me. Bit by bit, the footsteps began to quicken until they seemed to break into a run. Whoever, or whatever it was, had to expertly dodge our guy ropes to move at that speed without tripping. Every now and then something would brush the sides of the tent as Olivia and I were holding each other, doing our best not to make a noise. It was at this point that Jess woke up and groggily asked, "What the hell is going on?" She looked over to us, tears forming in our eyes, and shot up, terror crossing her face. she silently moved over to join us in our terror-filled huddle. Her question did not seem to faze whatever was making the noise. The sprinting went on for what felt like ages, but in reality it was probably only a minute or so until they stopped in front of our tent again. I slowly reached for a spare tent peg and gripped it as tight as I could, thinking that in a pinch it would do as some kind of weapon. The footsteps slowly did their wrap around the tents again before stopping behind ours and then retreating back to the tree line. With some insane burst of courage and morbid curiosity, I decided to take a look outside. Still gripping my tent peg, I slowly unzipped our tent, trying to be as soundless as possible. The fly unzipped from the bottom, so I laid down and peeked underneath, rather than unzip it and then potentially create more noise. The footsteps had seemed to stop shortly after their retreat, and there were no further noises. This would mean that the person would have had to get over a wire fence without a sound, which didn't seem plausible, but I saw absolutely nothing. Needless to say, the three of us didn't get any more sleep that night. When recounting this story to our leaders that morning, we were told we had probably heard a possum or some other animal, an explanation I simply do not buy. None of the other campers had heard anything. Some of the strangest parts of this experience to me are that there were no other sounds other than the footsteps and the occasional brushing of the tent, no heavy breathing or any spoken words or even animal noises. The person or thing seemed to disappear when I went to look, and the targeted and odd nature of the behaviour. Why was our tent targeted? Had something been looking for a target and when I awoke it chose us? Why did it just leave after scaring the ever-living daylights out of a group of teen girls? Why hadn't anyone else heard anything? Our tents were decently spaced apart for the guy ropes, so it's plausible that the noise was harder to hear for the other campers and maybe not enough to wake them, but the sound seemed fairly loud to us. If anyone has ever had a similar experience or has any idea what could have happened, I would love to hear about it. This isn't the only experience I've had while camping, and not the only one at this campsite, but certainly the only one of this magnitude.